This is Ndwandwe from PWI Expert, and we will be doing the demand side and the supply side approach to stimulate development, and we will also look at the north and south demand. Now, firstly, the first part of our lesson deals with the distinction between economic growth and economic development. So we will see that with your guideline, we have to distinguish. So if you assist your learners, they must be able to distinguish between economic growth and economic development. Now, economic growth, as we know, has to do with growing the economy. This is when we produce more goods and services in the economy, and we know that this is measured in terms of real GDP. So if we produce more goods and services this year than the previous year, it means our economy has grown. We have achieved economic growth. And the increase expressed as a percentage is referred to as economic growth rate. So this is when there is an increase in the production of goods and services in the economy. And next, how do we measure economic growth? How do we see that our economy has grown? This is measured in terms of real GDP. Now, it's measured by means of real GDP. Now, we need to emphasize that it is real GDP because nominal GDP overestimates our production in the economy because it is not adjusted to the inflation rate. So the learners should know that every time we use GDP figures, we must always use real GDP figures because that gives us the correct picture of our economy. And the third point is that for economic development to take place, there must be economic growth. In other words, we cannot have the improvement in the standard of living of the people, of the population, if we have not produced more goods and services. So it is a prerequisite for economic development. Now, there is something that I wish to also mention about that we cannot have economic development without economic growth, but we can have economic growth without economic development, which would mean that although the economy would have grown, but it would not have benefited the total population of the country. Then economic development has to do with the people. It refers to the increase or the improvement in the standard of living of the population. So this is the increase in the standard of living of the population. Now, what do we mean by the standard of living? The way the standard of living would refer to, for example, the goods and services that each citizen in the country enjoys. As we say, it is measured in terms of real GDP per capita. In other words, we take the real GDP and we divide by the population size to get the average, to see what is the income per head in the population. So this is measured by real GDP per capita, which means per person or per head, which is real GDP divided by the population size. Now, sometimes we find that different countries have, different real GDP figures. One country can have a bigger real GDP, like if we say it is the economic cake, but you find that the standard of living of the people living in that country is low. And what would be the cause? Of course, the answer lies in the population size. You might have a bigger economic cake, but if there is a lot of people to share that economic cake, and each one would get a thin slice of cake. So which means the population size is important for the standard of living of the people to improve. If we can exercise birth control, that would also alleviate poverty in the country, because if the real GDP is big and there's less population, it means the people in that country will be better off. So that was just as our introduction to distinguish between economic growth and economic development. So when we grow the economy, it has to do with goods and services, but economic development has to do with the people, the improvement in the standard of living. Now, with our guideline, we always refer to our guideline. The next section is discussing detail, which means this is a typical essay type question, discussing detail, the demand side approach in promoting growth and development. The demand side approach, as well as the supply side approach. Now, each one of them is a possible essay type question. Demand side and supply side approach. Now, to development. Colleagues, it is important to integrate what we are doing with what we have done before. This is not the first time that the demand side approach and the supply side approach comes into play. We have done this before, and for learners not to confuse things, we must always try and integrate. Just refer them back to when we discussed the demand side and the supply side approaches. But during that time, we were looking at it being used to smooth out the business cycles. Just to recap, you will remember that we had our business cycles, and to stimulate, this would be real GDP, economic activity, measured in terms of real GDP, and this would be time. Now you will remember that when the authorities try to smooth out these business cycles, in other words, trying to bring down the peaks and to try and level up the troughs, they applied the new economic paradigm, applies both the demand side and the supply side policies. Now, because we want to stimulate development, you will remember that we had expansionary measures to stimulate the economy. We also had contractionary measures. If the economy, you remember, we experienced inflation, the authorities would apply contractionary measures where they would try and depress the demand so that people would buy less, because when we have inflation, it's when we have too much money chasing too few goods. So we would have to apply the contractionary policy measures so that we fight inflation. We reduce the money in circulation. And down there we experienced unemployment. So in that instance, the authorities would have to stimulate the economy. Now, I'm interested in this one because this one would be in line with what we are doing at the moment, because we want to grow the economy. We also want to achieve economic development, improve the lives of the people. Then it means we must apply the expansionary measures. Now, for learners not to be confused, please try and integrate. Let us integrate. They must know that when we apply these measures here, we are smoothing out the business cycles, or we are trying to fine-tune the economy. But this time, we apply the demand side and the supply side policies to stimulate development. Now, let's look at the demand side approach. Now, as the term suggests, this approach focuses on stimulating the demand side of the economy. So all the measures that would be applied here would be to stimulate, aggregate demand, which is the total demand in the economy. And we know that even in the business cycles, the authorities applied two policies, which was the fiscal policy and the monetary policy. Now, the fiscal policy, we know that this is driven by the Department of Finance. And the monetary policy is driven by the South African Reserve Bank. Okay. Now, what are the instruments of the fiscal policy that the authorities would use to try and stimulate the economy? We know that this is fiscal policy. We looked at taxes and government spending. Now, the learner now has to explain how these measures or these instruments would be applied to try and stimulate economic growth in the economy as well as economic development. Now, taxes, we know, I just want to refer back to the business cycles because the learners would have discussed how these policies are used as expansionary measures. Now, if taxes are reduced, personal income taxes, for example, this leads to an increase in our YD, which is our disposable income, which is the income that the consumers are left with to spend. So if taxes are reduced, I remain with more money in my pocket to spend, which means this would definitely stimulate aggregate demand. So aggregate demand in the economy would rise because people now have more money than before. And if that happens, it forces the producers to increase their production. Now, once they start producing more than before, can you see that now we are achieving economic growth? The economy is now producing more goods and services than before. And for them to produce more, they need to employ more workers. You remember from our business cycles, these are the instruments or the policies that would be applied when we experience unemployment. You see. So during the time when we explained it with business cycles, these were used to fight or to combat unemployment. So when the producers have to produce more, then they are forced to employ more, which means that leads to an increase in employment. And if more people are employed, they even have more money. So more money is even injected in the economy, and this would, gain momentum. And if people have more money, the demand will increase, aggregate demand will increase, and producers will have to produce more. And if the people are employed, that would also improve their standard of living because they now have money which they did not have before. They can now afford goods and services they could not afford before. So their standard of living would improve. But not only that, if more people are employed, this leads to increase in tax revenue for the government. Why? Because people are working, they pay personal income tax. Businesses are making good profits. They are paying corporate tax to the government. People are spending, there's an increase in aggregate spending. They are paying indirect taxes like VAT and so on. So there would be an increase in government revenue. And we know that this government revenue would then be used to supply or to provide public services to the people, which means people will get electricity, people will get houses and so on, which is the improvement in the standard of living of the people. Now, so this time we are looking at the fiscal policy stimulating economic development. Previously, we looked at it trying to smooth out the business cycle. So the learners must know that as much as the measures or the instruments are the same, but the context in which they are applied is also important. Now let's look at the next instrument is government spending. Now we found this in the budget. So if they want to stimulate economic development, to improve the lives of the people, the government would spend more. You will remember that is, even with the business cycles, the taxes there would be reduced and government spending would be increased. And government spending is also an injection, and that will also stimulate economic growth because people will have more money. So if the old age pensions are increased, the grants are increased, and all the capital projects that the government would introduce, that would also inject money into people's pockets, and that would improve their standard of living. Okay. So that was the demand side policy, where the government or the authorities would try and manipulate the demand. Of course, they would have to stimulate the demand for economic growth and economic development to take place. Then we have the monetary policy. The monetary policy, as we have said, is driven by the SARB, the South African Reserve Bank. And all the instruments that would be applied by the South African Reserve Bank would either increase or decrease the money supply. So here, this would lead to changes in the supply of money. Again, money, supply of money. Again, because we want to stimulate economic growth, just like we wanted to stimulate the economy with our business cycles, we would have to apply the expansionary measures. Because what we want is that people must have money as a point of departure so that we stimulate aggregate demand, and then the process goes on and on. So, what is the role that should be played by the South African Reserve Bank to increase the money supply in the economy so that people would have money and stimulate aggregate demand? Producers would have to produce more, achieving economic growth and improving the standard of living of the people. Now, we know that the instruments that they use, or the measures used by the Reserve Bank with their monetary policy, we have the first one is our interest rates. Now, the interest rates, we know that if they are increased, they make buying on credit expensive, they make credit expensive, or if we drop interest rates, credit becomes cheaper, and this encourages people as well as businesses to invest, because this aggregate demand is by all the participants. It's not just the households, but also all these the 4 participants in our open economy. So in this case, because we want to stimulate economic growth, we want to stimulate aggregate demand and the standard of living, the Reserve Bank would have to reduce the interest rates. The reduction of interest rates would make credit cheaper, and this would stimulate. People would be motivated. Let me go and buy this because I will pay less as interest because of lower interest rates. Even the entrepreneurs, the businesses would also be encouraged to increase their investments, to take advantage of this reduced interest rates. So what happens then? So if interest rates are reduced, then people would borrow money because it is cheaper. They pay less interest. They would borrow money to spend, or they would borrow money if it is businesses to invest in their businesses, and they buy more machines, expand their businesses, and that also would mean that they now can produce more goods and services in the economy, and that would stimulate economic growth. And when consumers or households begin to spend more because of cheaper credit, that also takes us back to what happened. If they spend more, aggregate demand increases. Producers need to meet this increase in demand by producing more, and when we produce more, the economy is growing. That is economic growth, and the whole cycle, it repeats itself, gaining momentum, and in the process the economy grows, and also in the process the standard of living of people, of the population, improves, because in the process they get jobs, they need to be employed for the producers to produce more, and their standard of living would also improve. And the next, or the second instrument measure that would be used by the South African Reserve Bank as a monetary policy instrument is open market transaction. Transactions. Now, in this case, the South African Reserve Bank either buys or sells government securities, government bonds. Now, because we want to stimulate the economy, in other words, in this instance, we want to increase the supply of money, changes in the supply of money, and to be specific, in this instance, we have to increase the supply of money. But with the business cycles, you will remember that it depends on the economic circumstances prevailing. For example, as I've just said, the Reserve Bank would with interest rates, would either increase interest rates or decrease. It depends on the economic circumstances prevailing at that moment. For example, if we are experiencing high level of unemployment, we want to grow the economy, the Reserve Bank would have to reduce interest rates. But if we experience inflation there, we need to suppress demand, we must make credit expensive. So we would apply contractionary measures when we are experiencing inflation in the economy, and that would suppress demand and we would combat inflation. But in this instance, because we want to achieve economic growth and economic development, so we would also only be looking at the expansionary. So in which case we said interest rates will be reduced, and open market transactions, we said that this is where the South African Reserve Bank either buys or sells a government stock. Now, because the intention here, the objective is to inject money into the economy, then the Reserve Bank would have to buy or sell.
Buy, so that the money will flow from the government to
the money has to flow from the South African Reserve Bank to the banking sector, so that if the money is with the banking sector, then the banks can now lend it out to the people. So in this case, the South African Reserve Bank would then have to buy, so that the Reserve Bank would inject money. This would inject money into the banking system. And once the money is with the banks, the commercial banks, then it could be system. Then the people can come and raise loans, and that would stimulate aggregate demand, and it keeps the economic growth and economic development will then be stimulated. Number 3, the South African Reserve Bank can apply moral suasion or persuasion. Persuasion is the same thing. Now, in this instance, the South African Reserve Bank would just warn the commercial banks as to the prevailing economic circumstances, and then advise them as to how they should grant credit. Now, in this case, so in other words, they could warn them to be very conservative, not to give out credit easily, or they could warn the commercial banks to relax, giving out credit. So because we want to stimulate economic growth and development in this case, the Reserve Bank would advise the banks to relax, all the requirements. If people want to come and borrow money, they must relax. They must not be too conservative, because they want to inject money. They want to increase the supply of money. Now, most of the time we have seen if the Reserve Bank wants the commercial banks, for example, to reduce interest rates, it is the South African Reserve Bank, the Monetary Policy Committee, that would first reduce the repo rate. So they would then advise, they expect the commercial banks to follow the same. So if the MPC meets and they decide to reduce interest rates, once that is announced, you would, hear from the news, in the news later in the day that the FNB has announced that they would reduce their interest rates. FNB, all of them, they would follow suit because the Reserve Bank is trying to achieve certain goals in the economy, and they would also expect the commercial banks to cooperate to achieve those objectives. Then lastly, we have cash reserves requirements. Now, how does this work? Cash reserves. So for every deposits that the commercial banks receive from the clients, the South African Reserve Bank requires them to keep a certain percentage as cash reserves, so that when the clients need their money, the commercial banks they must be liquid, they must have cash available to dispense to their clients. So, for example, if the cash reserve requirement is 5%, this means that for every 100 rand that is deposited by the clients, the commercial banks must put aside 5% of that deposit, which is 5 rand, as a cash reserve. Now, how would this instrument or this measure be used to increase the supply of money? Remember that our objective here is that the supply of money must be increased in the economy. Now, if we have to increase the supply of money, we would have to reduce or increase that cash reserve requirement. We would have to reduce. Why? Because if it is at 5%, and they put aside 5 rands, which means the banks remain with 95 rands to give out as loans. But now that we want people to have more money, it means the Reserve Bank would reduce their official reserve requirement. If, for example, it is at 4%, now for every 100 rands, they would have to put aside 4 rands, and the banks remain with more money, 96 rands, to lend it out to the people. So this would increase the supply of money, and that would, once it reaches the participants, and then aggregate demand increases, and it would stimulate the economy, economic growth as well as economic development. So these are the four measures or instruments that will be applied by the South African Reserve Bank with their monetary policy to try and stimulate our economic growth as well as economic development. And you will see that both fiscal and monetary policy, they are all, the aim is, where is our slide? Yeah, this one. Once people have more money, because that is our objective, the fiscal policy would be applied in such a way that it stimulates, and it would stimulate the aggregate demand only when people have money. So when they apply these, they would apply them in such a way that they must people must have more money in their pocket so that they can begin to spend. And when they spend, producers need to produce more, and that's economic growth. And if they produce more, have to produce more, they will need to employ even more workers, and that would improve the standard of living of the people because they are employed. People would not be as poor as before. We know that unemployment is the main cause of poverty. So if people begin to get jobs, they would come out of poverty. And also, the government revenue will also increase, which is the revenue that the government uses to provide public goods and services, which improves the standard of living of the people. So all these measures, these two policies, the fiscal policy and the monetary policy, with their instruments, aim to achieve that story. Stimulate aggregate demand, producers must produce more, they will employ more, government will get more revenue from profits, from personal income tax, from indirect taxes, and that would achieve or stimulate economic growth and economic development. So, I don't know if our colleagues would have any contribution or any questions before we can proceed further. Mr. Nono, is there anything that you'd like to? Okay, thank you. Then I think we can now move further. Okay, then the next section here on economic growth and development deals with the approaches to growth and development policies used in South Africa, which is a section that would be tackled by my colleague here. All the development policies, strategies, and initiatives. Oh, but before we get there, we need to do the supply side approach. Also, we would like to integrate. Remember, with our business cycles, we wanted to smooth real GDP. Time. The objective of applying the supply side approach was to smooth, to fine-tune the economy. So whatever that we have covered with the demand side approach, to stimulate the economy, you will remember this diagram: price, quantity, aggregate demand, and aggregate supply. Price level at the equilibrium point, then quantity Q1. So you will recap from what we have done with the demand side approach. So if it is the demand side approach, it means we manipulate the aggregate demand. We want to shift to increase the aggregate demand. So all the policies that have been applied, the monetary and fiscal policies, were expansionary, trying to increase aggregate demand, and which would mean that our aggregate demand curve would have shifted to the right. So whatever we have done before, whatever we have just covered, was meant to increase aggregate demand. But you will remember from the business cycles that if we stimulate aggregate demand, which means we try to stimulate the economy so that it enters the expansion period, the problem or the challenge we have is that it grows until it gets over-saturated. And this is when inflation kicks in. So graphically you can see, as aggregate demand increases, look at what happens to the prices. The inflation kicks in. They were trying to fight unemployment, growing the economy, people are working, they have money, aggregate demand, they are spending. And if aggregate supply cannot meet that increase in aggregate demand, then inflation kicks in. So that is how we landed there. Inflation kicked in. And then to smooth out the business cycles, then the government had to introduce, previously the authorities would concentrate on manipulating the aggregate demand. So if they wanted to fight inflation, they would also have to suppress demand. In other words, the measures that were applied here, they would have to apply the reverse. They would have to reduce the money supply, and whatever they did when we were stimulating the economy. For example, taxes with the fiscal policy, taxes would now have to be increased so that the disposable income decreases and aggregate spending decreases. So if aggregate spending decreases, it would shift to the left. So if it shifts to the left, you can see inflation, prices begin to drop. So previously, they would focus on the aggregate demand side. But then when they introduced the new economic paradigm, you will remember that So with the new economic paradigm, they then introduced the supply side approach to fight both the evils in the business cycles, both unemployment and inflation, such that Q1, such that if aggregate demand is stimulated, instead of the prices, inflation increasing, then they will try and make sure that the prices remain the same. In other words, they want to achieve economic growth that would create job opportunities with zero inflation. So if aggregate demand increases, let us meet that increase in demand by increasing or producing more. So can you see now, they are now manipulating the supply side of the economy. So that is how the two are married. If aggregate demand increases, let us meet that increase in demand by manipulating the supply side of the economy so that the economy can produce more goods and services to meet that increase in demand. So with business cycles, that was to fine-tune the economy, to fight inflation and unemployment. You remember, if we will not go as far back as, but just to recap that, this is when the Phillips curve comes in. PC. This is when the Phillips curve comes in. You remember this is inflation rate and unemployment. And this is the natural rate of unemployment. And if we try to reduce unemployment from there to there, this would be accompanied by an increase in inflation. That is what was happening here. If we try to fight unemployment, it eventually lands us on inflation. And if we try to fight inflation, people buy less, producers have to produce less, they would have to lay off some of the workers. It leads to unemployment. Such that we had to introduce the supply side policy, which shifted the PC curve to the left, such that that level of unemployment that we required or that we wanted to achieve could now be achieved with zero inflation, which means the natural rate of unemployment. So what actually assisted us to shift the PC curve to the left, such that the lower level of unemployment becomes our natural rate of unemployment, was the supply side policies. So if we could apply the supply side policy, we could fight more, because if aggregate supply increases to that level, you can see how much the economy grows. And with that level of growth in the economy, this would have created job opportunities. So you can see that growth reduces unemployment, and also the price level, the inflation rate is 0%. The prices could have increased to that level, but with the introduction of the aggregate supply, we managed to keep the inflation rate. Now that was for the business cycles. So the same the supply side policies can now be used to stimulate economic growth and economic development. This is just for integration purposes. Now, the guideline, always we refer to the guideline because when the exams, it is the examination guideline, which means it guides us as to the examinable content. So the guideline gives us these four bullets of the supply side approach. So in other words, now we are trying to manipulate the supply. Firstly, we manipulated the demand. Now we want to increase the supply in the economy. Now, firstly, we look at efficiency and effectiveness. Oh, I think I'll need to. Okay, now what do we do when we say we improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the markets? We reduce unnecessary deregulation. This is one of them. Now we find that there are unnecessary rules and regulations that become barriers for small entrepreneurs, for example, the informal sector, to participate in the economy, the mainstream economy. But if these informal businesses could have access to the markets, for example, this would increase the number of entrepreneurs producing goods and services in the economy, and we would achieve economic growth. So reducing unnecessary regulations, that is deregulations. Also increasing competition. Now we increasing competition. Now how do we achieve this competition? Now this takes us to our imperfect markets, you will remember from our markets that there are barriers. With the imperfect markets, you will remember that there are barriers that prevent other businesses from entering the markets, like legal barriers, where, for example, you would have to have a license for you to be able to operate, to access. There are many, many more. So if you let's take our learners back to the markets, and we would see the evils of imperfect markets. And as a result, we know that we have the Competition Act, which tries to encourage competition so that more and more businesses can have access into the markets. And we may even try and attract the foreign investors, foreign direct FDIs, foreign direct investments, to be part of our economy so that more businesses can enter the market and more goods and services could be produced. And we also look at privatization. Now, in this case, you remember that privatization is when ownership of private institutions, the SOEs, is transferred to the private. In other words, the aim of privatizing the state-owned enterprises would be to try and expose these businesses to market conditions so that the private businesses also have an opportunity to provide services that are of strategic importance in the country. So privatization is also part of the efficiency and effectiveness of our markets. Okay, and then number 2, we have the cost of doing business. Now, we know that from grade 9, when we started teaching demand and supply, factors that influence supply was the cost of production. If the cost of production can be reduced, that would increase supply. But if the cost of production is high, then the businesses can produce less. So the cost of doing business must also be lowered. Now, in South Africa, the cost of infrastructure must be taken into infrastructure, that is transport, energy and communication infrastructure. So for businesses to be able to produce more, supply more in the economy, the cost of infrastructure, like energy, for example, electricity, transport and communications must be lowered. 2, there must be a reliable and plentiful supply of water and energy. Now you can see, if there is load shedding, what happens? There is a cost involved there, because during load shedding, no goods and services are produced, which would mean that that would lead to a reduction in the supply or the production of goods and services. So there must be reliable and plentiful water supply and supply and energy. Also, the transport cost must be lower. The cost of doing business, other costs include the admin costs. You see, when the government requires the businesses to provide reports, tax returns and things like that, for businesses that is a cost. It could be a huge cost, which would mean that they now have less towards the production of more goods and services. So administration costs, admin costs must also be taken into account. So if the government can come in and try and reduce the cost of doing business, this would also lead to more goods and services produced in the country. And then we also look at the inputs, the factors. So the supply side policy does not just include the factors of production alone. Let's make our learners aware by using the guideline. It will guide us. Efficiency and efficiency of markets, business efficiency, the cost of doing business, and then the factors of production. Now, the factors of production, for example, number one, we have labor or human resource. Now, what should be done with the human resources or our labor for them to produce more goods and services? Now, we can see that the quantity and quality of these factors of production. Now, the quantity refers to the number. So, the more labor we have, and the quality refers to the skill. And the more skilled they are, the more productive our workers will be. So the government also, that is why the government introduced the CETAs, so that the workers could get training whilst on the job, and that would improve their skills level and become more productive. So here we look at education and training is important. To improve the skill of our workers so that they become more productive. Then the second factor of production is our natural resources. Also the same, with our natural resources, the quantity and the quality is important. How can we make best use of our limited? We know that our natural resources, the supply is fixed, we cannot increase because they are not man-made. But how can we make good use of whatever we have to try and produce more goods and services? So availability and better use of our natural resources would stimulate economic growth and the supply side of the economy. Then we have capital. The same. For capital, the quantity and the quality. So let's try and be technologically advanced. Use capital formation is important. Let's get rid of the primitive methods or the ineffective methods of production, but you remember from grade 11, we have capital formation, we have capital deepening, and capital widening. Capital deepening is even better because it increases the amount of capital per worker. And if we can achieve that, more capital, more machines, more business, more factory buildings, it means we will produce more goods and services. And technology, is now regarded, sometimes referred to as the fifth factor of production. So technology works in line together with the capital, because if we apply the latest technology that is faster and that would even decrease our average cost, that would improve the supply side of the economy. And then the entrepreneurship. Let's have more people starting businesses, entrepreneurship. So here we find that the government comes in trying to assist the SMMEs, for example, by providing assistance in terms of capital, because other entrepreneurs might have good business ideas, but they cannot be implemented because of lack of capital. So the government comes in and we have institutions such as Kula Enterprises, we have CEDAs, we have Vitala, all those institutions would provide not just financial assistance, but sometimes they even give them training on how to run their businesses, bookkeeping, and things like that. So if these factors of production, the quantity and the quality, can be improved, and that would mean that businesses would produce more, which would then increase the supply side of the economy. Now, this takes me to the end of the supply side approach. And as I have said, that the policies would be tackled by my colleague, Mr. Ndwandwe. And then just the last part of this section gives us the North and South divide. Now, the North and South divide has got, shows us the differences between the developed countries and the developing countries. Now, why North-South divide? Because initially the developed countries were situated on the north, and the developing countries were geographically situated on the south. But this has now, it has got nothing to do with the geographical location of the country, because you find that there is a developed country that is on the south. So for north, we are actually referring to the developed countries, and the south referring to less developing countries. Now, the guideline requires us to compare these countries in the north to those in the south. And colleagues, let us be cognizant of what is required from the guideline, that we compare them in terms of unequal standard of living, challenges, and environment. So you will remember that this is not a new section. Previously, we used to compare these countries in terms of different characteristics. But please make sure that you now refer to what our latest guideline requires. So we compare them in terms of the standard of living, which includes, we compare the per capita income, life expectancy, and education. I'll just project that section, the table. And then we look at challenges of globalization, where we compare these countries in terms of poverty, growth, and trade. And lastly, we compare them in terms of the environment, countries in the north and countries in the south, who are the culprits of destroying the environment. Now, I'll just project that section. Okay, I think this explains it very well. So firstly, we said the standard of living, where we look at real GDP per capita, which is real GDP per head, per person in the country. Obviously, developed countries would have high real GDP per capita, and the South or developing countries would have low real GDP per capita. One of the reasons, of course, you find these are industrialized and their real GDP is high, and the developing countries have low real GDP, and on top of that, their population, there's high population growth. So you can work it out. You remember we said real GDP per capita is real GDP divided by the population. So you can imagine, if the real GDP is lower and the population size is bigger, it's just a mess. So for the lower, for the developing countries, the real GDP is lower than that of the developed countries. This is right at the end. Okay, still on the standard of living, we said life expectancy, which refers to the years that a person is expected to live. You can see, with developed countries, they live longer, 75 years, and with developing countries, the life expectancy is lower because they are also malnutrition, poor health care, and diseases, which brings their life expectancy low. Education, which is literacy level, of course, the developed countries, there's high level of education literacy rate, whilst developing countries it is low. Then number two, we compare them in terms of globalization inequalities, where we look at the poverty level. They are less poor than the developing countries. So poverty level is low. With the South, poverty level is high. Economic growth, developed countries are industrialized, high, and they rely on primary sectors. The economic growth there is low. Production and trade, the manufacturing, that is the industrialized and receive subsidies, whereas the developing countries produce raw materials, agriculture, mining without subsidies. So if they produce raw materials, they will export these raw materials and get less than when they have to import manufactured food at higher prices. Then lastly, we compare them in terms of the environment. Mass production and consumption damages the ozone layer, which makes the countries in the north responsible for damaging the ozone layer because they are highly industrialized. So mass production and consumption damages the ozone layer caused by pollution and toxic substances. So the developed countries are mainly responsible for damaging the ozone layer, and the developing countries are affected more negatively. Sustainable development, which is the pattern of development that permits future generations to live as well as the current generation. You remember the last chapter is on environment sustainability. Are we able to sustain the environment such that the future generations should find the environment still suitable for survival? So the practices used in production are more in favor of sustainable development, and whereas with the developing countries, production practices do not promote sustainable development. For example, their farming methods destroy the environment because they do not practice efficient use of the natural resources or the environment. I think just to add to that, we can see the comparison between these two countries. Unequal standard of living per capita, income, they now give us the statistics so that you can see 87% of the world's total income produced by 15% of the world's population, which is the norm. So 85% is produced by 15% of the world's, and the remaining 85 live on 20%, which is the countries in the south. Life expectancy, we have done that. in the developing countries are battling with malnutrition, diseases, ill health, and their life expectancy that as a result is lower at 48 compared to 75 for the developed countries. Education, we also saw that it is low for the developing countries. Adult literacy rate, an indicator of education levels, the adult literacy there is like 46%. South Africa's adult literacy rate is at 86%, so that makes us, better. Then the globalization, inequalities, the poverty, growth, trade, and the environment as the table reflected. This brings me to the end of my presentation. I would now have to hand over to my colleague to do the rest. Thank you.